Running under the theme China and Africa toward an even stronger community with a shared future through win-win cooperation, the summit of the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, or FOCAC, is exploring new paths that will elevate the Sino-African cooperation to a higher level. Yet China-Africa ties are not perceived in the same way across the Western world, with the US President Donald Trump using insulting terms to describe African countries and some Western media raising concerns over a so-called new colonialism by China in the African continent. So what's the media's role in shaping perceptions? And as China's Belt and Road Initiative enters its 5th year, how are journalists from China and Africa portray China-Africa cooperation? For more insights, I'm pleased to be joined in the studio by journalists who have been running stories about China-African relations. They are Hudson Kuteesa from the New Times from Rwanda and Trix, Ingado, Luvindi from the Kenya television network from Kenya. Welcome, the warmest welcome to both of you. Trix, let me go to you first. Tell us a little bit about what you do and how often do you come across China-related topics?
Well, what I do basically is sit on the international news desk, and I report basically on what's happening around the world in relation to the people's interest in Kenya. At the same time, I do field reporting on local current affairs. So this is a typical day of mine would be to find out what's the biggest headlines internationally, and if there's a story locally, that's what I'll be on.
How often do you come across a China-related story?
So China does make it to the Kenyan media basically in terms of business, because Chinese interests in Kenya have typically and traditionally been business-wise. Perhaps if there's a big deal that's going down, or maybe if there's a cooperation efforts in a certain sector, then we would find China making headlines. So a lot of the times you'd find it in the business section of our bulletins. Yeah.
Do you feel, given the kind of increased interaction between China and Africa, do you feel enough has been said, enough is being said about China, between China and Africa through your media?
Particularly in Kenya, I think a lot has been said, especially with the completion of the first phase of the standard gauge railway. So it has been a very innovative thing that has come to the Kenyan transport scene. And you know, with Vision 2030, infrastructure is one of the things that's being given priority. So the completion of that railway was a huge deal for the Kenyans across the nation, and obviously this made headlines in many different ways.
Let's talk in greater details in just a moment, but Hudson, let me go to you first. You come from Rwanda and from the New Times, which is the only newspaper in Rwanda. What is your typical day, and how much does your work have to do with China?
Well, my typical day starts, because I'm a journalist, I do not specialize in a lot of things, but I have been typically covering Sino-Rwanda relations, so I quite know a lot about the things that are always going on. Rwanda and China, we always have a lot of things that like projects. We have a lot of Chinese projects in Rwanda. We have roads, we have a hospital that is run by Chinese, so every now and then I'm always covering Chinese stories, and so it's really interesting. What
was the last story, for instance, that you wrote either before you came to China or while you have been here? What was the last story that you wrote about China?
The last story I wrote about China was about my president, Paul Kagame. He's going to lead the delegation that's going to come here for the Forum on Africa-China Cooperation, and he's coming here, and I wrote a story that he's going to be one of the 4 key speakers that are going to address the opening ceremony. Yeah.
What was the central idea of that piece, besides providing these basic information? For instance, what is the tone of your report towards a Forum on China-Africa Cooperation?
I must say right now that Africa is really upbeat for this forum that is coming up. People have a lot of expectations. It's not just the leaders, but everyone that has been following China-Africa relations, they have a lot of expectations. So I really wanted to inform not only Rwandans but also Africans, because when my president comes here, he's going to be speaking as a leader of the delegation, as the AU chair. So I wanted really to inform that there is something taking place, and Africa is right now having a lot of expectations, and this is what I wanted to do, like not just to raise expectations but to speak and say this is what is there. Yeah.
So a lot of information you want to send out, a lot of stories that you have covered. What have been the perceptions of your viewership, your audience, your users towards these stories that you have covered? Trix, do you hear from, when you talk to ordinary Kenyans, what are their understanding towards what China is doing in Kenya, for instance?
I think because you don't typically find a lot of Chinese experts on Kenyan media trying to talk, perhaps it's a policy, so there's a lot of curiosity and a lot of...
It is not a policy.
I don't
think it is a policy.
But you would rarely find them going out of their way to give press conferences, at least in Kenya, on what's happening on the ground with regards to China and Kenya. But this has resulted in a lot of curiosity. They want to find out, because we notice a lot more Chinese companies working together with our Kenyan counterparts in the country. So there has been an uptick in curiosity. So when I do a story about China, perhaps like my last story was about the FOCAC preparations, there was a reception in that they want to know what this is all about and what...
Where was this reception?
In Kenya.
In Kenya.
In Kenya. So I did a story about the preparations for FOCAC, and from my editor, she was pleasantly surprised by the outlook of the diplomats here in Beijing, the African diplomats, who are very positive about the future of China-Africa relations. And this is something that the local audience also wants to see. They want to know what the leadership and what the diplomatic community here in China is perceiving this increased or deepening relationship between China and Africa is.
You used the word pleasantly surprised.
Yes.
That your editor was having this feeling when you sent back your report. Why is that? I mean, for us, we feel that we have talked a lot, we have said a lot, we have interviewed a lot of these ambassadors, but it seems that these information are not reaching the people in Africa, in the streets.
It's because, for whatever reason, access to the grassroots in China is doesn't come easily for African journalists. So when you have this unprecedented access and you get to speak to diplomats and you interview them and you film and you package it into a very good story that actually gives an outlook, and they're giving you the numbers, the perception, how this is going to work, and you are able to package it into a good comprehensive story and air it back home, and now a Kenyan can sit at home and listen and understand that also this is what the Chinese are doing, then it's a good thing, because now we are able to give another side of the story that is rarely seen by the normal observer.
Hudson, let me ask your understanding of what you're doing here. By the way, I should maybe explain to our viewers that both Hudson and Trix, you are on a longer term program as part of a cooperation project between China and Africa, which is to train African journalists here in China. So you will be spending a total of 10 months or so in China, traveling in different places, writing reports, and basically seeing China, feeling China for yourself. So Hudson, how is this experience shaping your understanding of China, and how is that filling a gap in the information landscape of Rwandans?
Well, when you ask about how this is changing my perception about China, it is doing it to a big deal, because before I came to China, there is a lot of things that I knew China for, and this could only be changed if I came here and saw for myself. And I don't just see for myself, but I also report what I see. So I don't just change my own perception, but I end up also changing the perceptions of other readers of my stories about what China is. So a lot of things have changed. I've known that it's possible for Africa to rise out of poverty. I've read such an amazing story that China has put about 800 million people out of poverty, and I really think it's possible, and there's a lot of positivity. When I look around in all that I've seen, I think Africa can learn a lot from China, and so yeah, a lot of good perception that I've seen here in China.
Yeah. You want to give us maybe one example of one moment that really you know, as you said, maybe you visited a poor village, or what would be a moment that stayed in your mind?
Yeah, I've ever visited a poor village, and I really loved how the government is helping the people, but I'm also really interested how the people themselves are at the core of rising out of poverty. No one is sitting back, no one is complaining, no one is just saying this is it, we just have to be in poverty. Everyone is fighting. So as the government is taking the lead, the people themselves, and this is really important. Yeah.
And Trix, any moment that stayed in your mind when you were also in China? Yeah, seeing things, any shock, any big surprise?
It wouldn't be as a shock as much as it would be intrigue, because we went to Sanya, and there are these beautiful traditional practices by the Li and the Miao communities, and that just stood out for me because it was really colorful.
The ethnic minorities on the
minorities.
island in southern China.
Yes, and they were using what they had, and the beautiful practices and the tattoos, and they would showcase it in very well organized villages, and you would just see how they're using what they have to earn a living, and as well as promote tourism. And that's a kind of diversity that you don't see a lot, or you hear a lot. Well, when you think of Africa, you think about all these traditional practices, but then I think for a foreigner looking in, this is a really beautiful thing that the village and the local governments there were doing, and I found that to be something really noteworthy and beautiful. And perhaps another thing is the Hong Kong-Zhuhai Macau bridge that goes underwater and comes out, and it's just amazing feat of engineering that I think it is just admirable what the Chinese engineers have managed to accomplish in that part of China.
Okay, I have been talking to two journalists from Africa on the upcoming China-Africa Forum on Cooperation. We'll take a very short break, and we'll be back right after this. Stay right here. Welcome back. My guests today are Hudson Kuteesa from the New Times from Rwanda, and Trix Ingado Luvindi from the Kenya television network. So let's get to some more thorny questions after talking about changing perceptions. And let's be frank, international media coverage about China's relationship with Africa I would say more negative than positive. If I go on the international social media websites, if I type the keyword China-Africa, I would say the majority of stories coming out are negative. For instance, the most recent piece I just checked is this one by the Financial Times. Chinese model is failing Africa. You know, it's not just negative, it's also very sensational. And this one about on the Forbes website, it's an opinion piece, what does China do in Africa? And it says the reason Chinese corporations are in Africa is simple: to exploit the people and take their resources. So first of all, how truthful do you find these kind of reports, without looking at the contents yet? And why do you think so many articles are so negative about China's activity in Africa?
Well, I wouldn't say I know the motivation behind it, but I have indeed seen that there is a bit of a negative perception of what China's interest in Africa is. Is it because it is a new formidable competition to other interests in other countries having interest in Africa, or is it true? Who knows? But the thing is that as a journalist, you want to see for yourself. Because I have been here in Beijing for 6 months, and I have attended countless conferences on China-Africa relations, and the most consistent thing I hear from the Chinese officials is that we want a win-win cooperation. We want to work together with Africa on things like poverty, and harness both our efforts and our powers for a common goal. So when I would imagine that when these deals are struck, there's a meeting with Chinese officials and Africa officials, both gunning for the same developmental goals. So the question would be, who is representing Africa in these meetings, and are they representing Africa well? At the end of the day, it's what you bring up to the table and what you agree to sign that matters, not really what the Chinese intentions are. Let's just entertain the idea for 1 minute. Let's say maybe China has some negative intention. Would it actually happen without someone on the other side signing off? So I feel like the experts or the officials from the African sides should have our interests at heart, so that when we come together for this so-called win-win cooperation, we're both looking for a wholesome outcome, and it is actually going to trickle down to the people.
From the China and Africa have had a relationship spanning decades, right? And in recent years that has been elevated to a much higher level. Numerous projects. I would imagine that in Kenya there are many of such examples. So from what is happening on the ground, without reading these Western media coverage, what is what you have seen? Because you say, you know, African countries who are representing Africa in this kind of deal, they need to be looking out. So what is really happening on the ground?
What I have seen as a Kenyan is that there has been a lot of improvement in infrastructure. Just literally looking at my life as a Nairobian going to work, we have the Mombasa-Nairobi highway, which is so much better than what was there before, and this was accomplished in collaboration with the Chinese government. Then we have the SGR, standard gauge railway, that has shortened the span of travel between Mombasa and Nairobi from what used to be 24 hours, that is if it doesn't break down, to a mere 7 hours at a very affordable rate. So going by that, just as a civilian, I think we have accomplished a lot, and this is part of the Vision 2030 that is supposed to improve the lives of a normal Kenyan by the time we get to 2030. So far from just what I see as a consumer of these services, or a consumer of the outcomes of our cooperation, I think life has been made better for the normal, we call them wananchi, the normal citizen.
Fair enough, fair enough. Hudson, what is your understanding of the overwhelming negativity of Western reports about China's activity in Africa? Or maybe you perceive things differently?
Well, what I can say is whenever something new is coming up, there is a lot of people get nervous. For example, the BRI, Belt and Road Initiative, it's such a mega unprecedented initiative, and so people had to be nervous, especially from the Western world. What will come of the BRI? It's mega, it's massive, so
and it's new. Nobody
has ever imagined it, and so they're like, will it fail? There's a lot of questions, but I think there has been a lot of trust between China and Africa. I want to use the words of President Kagame, which he said when President Xi visited Rwanda. He said that China treats Africa as unequal. So it's like we are peers. China and Africa, we are peers. So the whole fact that Western media is saying that there is a lot of mistrust between Africa and China, I think it's all as a result of the nerve that comes when you see something big and new coming up.
Yeah. Well, on the other hand, we do feel that maybe there is also greater work that can be done on our part, either on the part of the Chinese government, or on the private enterprises who are investing in Africa, and on us as media professionals as well. So what kind of potentials do you see in better telling what is happening between China and Africa, and what can be done there? For instance, you talked about the curiosity the Kenyan people have, and so far we seem not to have been able to fill that curiosity except through journalist from Kenya.
Yeah.
How do you, what kind of potential can be tapped into?
I think it's just a question of having more access, and perhaps the approach that we go to, not in a confrontational way, but more in a what can we learn and how can we understand the Chinese, and how so that we can pit it against our own self, our cultures and our practices, so that we can better understand what is going on. And perhaps having more media, I guess, presence, because when you see companies setting up all over, anyone would get nervous if several 5 African companies just set up shop in your neighborhood. You'd wonder what's happening, you know. So perhaps if we had more information going out to the people, just explaining what's happening here, you know.
So basically you're also saying there need to be greater people-to-people exchanges, cultural exchanges. Are you seeing that kind of things happening, and maybe to a greater extent? I
do see, because for the first time in my life I've met Chinese people who speak fluent Swahili, which is really interesting, because I am attached to the CRI Swahili station, and they speak really fluent Swahili, and I think that goes to enable, and these are Chinese people who understand the Chinese culture, so when they are giving their news or their shows, they give a very new, interesting perspective to the East African audience that is listening to them. And I'm thinking maybe we could have more youth in China interested in Chinese, youth in China interested in African culture, perhaps African practices, and vice versa, having more people like me coming to China and experience.
Well, I think indeed, if you look at what the Chinese government has proposed from the 2015 FOCAC summit in Johannesburg, a lot of such projects, right? There are 10 major plans to bring the people closer, and China has, for instance, proposed that China will help set up 5 cultural centers in Africa, help 10,000 African villages to receive satellite TV programs, to provide 2,000 opportunities for African students to acquire a degree or to get a diploma, and 30,000 government scholarships for Africans. Every year organize 200 African scholars to visit China, seminars for 500 Africans, and train 1,000 media professionals. I mean, the list really goes on. So, Hudson, I think there is this will, right? I mean, I'm seeing this will of the Chinese government to increase the kind of people-to-people exchange. On the part of Africa, do you think something can be done better?
Well, first of all, I will speak about the 10 cooperation programs, the 10 cooperation plans. I think a lot has been done ever since 2015. We can say China has fulfilled its promise, and we can say that, like my president, I always like to quote from President Kagame. He says that we Africans, we can do it by ourselves. So when we have seen the success that China is doing in Africa, what remains is we to do it by ourselves. So actually, if you speak to our leaders, they always come here, no question, they are always saying they are satisfied by the fact that China is fulfilling what is been always pledging to Africa. But what really remains is that we act for us on our part to see that the success that our partners are rooting for is not, doesn't go vain.
What's going to happen then, you think, during this year's forum, and what kind of boost do you think this year's forum can give to China-Africa ties?
Well, there is a lot of expectation. I myself, as a journalist, I have expectations, and people back home have a lot of expectations. We always can count on the China-Africa relation to be humanitarian, to always focus on the people, the Africans that are always down. And so we have a lot of expectations. One of the stories that I wrote recently was saying that e-commerce and education are going to be featuring on this edition of the FOCAC. And I think e-commerce is really important. I've known that it's one of the tools that the Chinese government is using to raise people out of poverty. And I really think that if we use e-commerce, there's a lot of African people that can benefit from this year. So these are some of my expectations.
So you're going to write about it? You're going to do stories about it for sure, maybe?
Yeah. Yeah.
Trix, what are you looking out for during this year's forum, besides the grandiose family photos?
Well, aside from that, obviously we want to see what's going to be the next step in China-Africa relations, not just for Kenya. Kenya has had a warm relationship with China for, given the projects that I have mentioned. But at the same time, what is there going forward? Because we were at a previous conference just the other day, and they said they're going to work further closely to help eradicate poverty through agriculture, which is a very huge thing, especially for Africa that has fertile soil. We have a lot of land, we have a lot of youth that are unemployed that can actually go into farming and just work together with experts from China and learn better farming practices to have more production. So there are some very constructive areas that this upcoming forum can explore further to ensure that we are doing
basically
better.
China itself is also a developing country,
Yes.
and I'm really allow me to ask you this question. Why in the past have not more developed Western countries provided this kind of agricultural modernization opportunity for African countries? Why is China doing this?
I have a perception that China is more interested in a kind of development or that is win-win, like they're always saying, because China wants to get itself out of that status of developing, and Africa is the continent with the most developing nations. So we have a conjecture there. We are both going for the same goal, and China has something to bring to the table. Africa also has a need and has something to bring to the table. So if we put our expertise and our resources together, I think this is the perception of China in pushing for this cooperation.
Okay, we're going to leave it there. Many thanks to my two guests, Hudson Kuteesa from the New Times from Rwanda, and Trix Ingado Luvindi from the Kenya Television Network from Kenya. And that is it for this edition of The Point with me, Lucien. As always, follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle The Point with LX. Download the application called CGTN to watch the show on your mobile devices, or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. Thanks for watching. You've got The Point.